She collapsed on the most beautiful street in Milan. Not in some quiet back alley, not in a taxi, not somewhere private where the fall could be absorbed by shadows and silence. She collapsed on Via Monte Napoleone in the middle of Fashion Week, in front of every polished window and tailored stranger the city had to offer. Her portfolio hit the marble pavement first, then her knees, then the rest of her. Amara Johnson, 34 years old, creative director of one of London's fastest-growing design agencies, a woman who had spent the last decade learning exactly how not to need anyone, folded onto the cold stone like something the city had simply decided to discard. People walked around her. That was the first thing she noticed when consciousness came back in fragments. Heels clicking, wheels rolling, voices sharp and fast and Italian, none of them pausing. She was a disruption in the current, and the current did not stop. She tried to push herself up. Her arms shook. Her vision swam in wide, nauseating arcs. She had not eaten since the flight from Heathrow. She had not slept properly in 4 days. She had been running on pride and adrenaline, and the particular kind of desperation that looks from the outside exactly like ambition. And then a hand came down. Not tentative. Not the polite kind of help that half offers itself and retreats the moment it might be inconvenient. A firm hand, warm, pressing flat against her back, the other wrapping under her arm before she had even registered that someone had stopped. A voice came with it. Deep Italian accented English, steady in a way that made her feel, against every instinct she possessed, like she was allowed to be unsteady. "I have you. Don't try to stand yet." She looked up, and the world, which had already been spinning, spun in an entirely different direction. If you've ever had a moment where time didn't just slow down, but actually bent, where the present and the past collapsed into each other so completely that you couldn't tell which one you were living in, then you already understand something about what happened to Amara Johnson on the pavement of Via Monte Napoleone on a grey October morning. Because the man kneeling beside her, with his charcoal coat and his careful hands and his face that was older now, but unmistakably, devastatingly the same, was Marco Ferretti. The man she had loved at 22. The man she had left without a word. The man she had spent 12 years pretending she had forgotten. Stay with this story, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about the choices we make when we are young and afraid, and what those choices cost us, not all at once, but slowly, invisibly, over the years we spend running from them. Amara had grown up in Brixton, South London, the eldest daughter of a Ghanaian nurse and a Jamaican musician who believed deeply in two things: hard work and the dignity of taking up space in rooms that weren't built for you. Her mother, Adwoa, used to press a firm hand against Amara's shoulder blades every time she tried to make herself smaller in company, a silent physical reminder: stand straight, they see you anyway, you might as well be seen on your own terms. She had carried that hand with her into every room she ever entered. Into art school at 17, where she was one of 3 black women in her entire program. Into her first internship in Paris at 20, where her portfolio was twice as detailed as anyone else's, because she had understood early that excellence for her would not be a recommendation. It would be a requirement. And into the study abroad program in Florence at 22, where she met a quiet, intense third-year architecture student named Marco Ferretti, who had a habit of drawing buildings in the margins of unrelated notebooks, and who looked at her work, the first time he saw it, with an expression she had never seen on anyone's face before. Not admiration, not attraction, though that came later. Something closer to recognition, as though he had been waiting for someone who saw the world the way she did and had almost given up. They became inseparable over the course of that autumn in Florence. Not loudly. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic first kiss over a candlelit dinner. What they had was quieter and stranger and more profound than that. Long evenings in his studio apartment near Santo Spirito, her sketchbook spread across his drafting table, both of them working in comfortable silence that felt more intimate than any conversation. He made strong coffee. She brought the music. He showed her his blueprints. She showed him color and proportion in ways his architecture training had never framed. They taught each other how to see, and somewhere in the middle of all that seeing they fell. She never told him she loved him, not directly. That was the first thing she would think about years later, when the regret had matured enough to be examined clearly. She showed it in every other way, in the way she reorganized her schedule to be near him, in the way she laughed differently when he was in the room, in the way she spent 3 days redesigning a presentation for a project of his that he hadn't even asked for help with, just because she wanted to see his face when he realized someone had understood what he was trying to build. But the words themselves never came. They were too large and too permanent, and she was 22 and London was waiting, and her mother had raised her to be excellent, but had not quite raised her to be vulnerable. When the program ended and she had to go home, she packed everything in one afternoon while he was in a lecture. She left a note, 11 words. She had counted them afterward, and for a long time, those 11 words felt like the most expensive thing she had ever produced. She never heard back from him. She told herself that was what she wanted. She got very, very good at telling herself that. And now here he was, kneeling on cold marble beside her 12 years later, with steadier hands than she remembered, and eyes that were doing exactly what she was afraid of, looking at her with recognition, with something careful and unresolved, with the particular expression of a man who has practiced indifference toward a specific subject and is discovering in real time that the practice was insufficient. "Amara," he said, not a question. "Marco," she said, not an answer. He helped her up. She did not have the physical reserves to refuse. If you're watching this and you've ever made a decision you couldn't undo, if you've ever chosen safety over something that terrified you with its importance, subscribe to this channel. Because the rest of this story is for you and we are only just beginning. He did not take her to a hospital, at least not immediately. He took her to a chair inside the Ferretti Group's Milan headquarters, which occupied the top 3 floors of a building on Via della Spiga that had been in his family for 4 generations. His assistant, a brisk, immaculately efficient woman named Ginevra, materialized with water, crackers, and a look that communicated clearly that she had seen Marco Ferretti composed in every conceivable circumstance and was mildly unsettled by what she was currently observing. Amara drank the water. She ate the crackers with the particular gracelessness of someone whose blood sugar had dropped below any concern for appearances. She looked around the room, high ceilings, raw concrete walls, an enormous drafting table repurposed as a meeting surface, architectural models in glass cases along one wall, and felt something that was partly wonder and partly grief, because the room looked exactly like what his apartment in Florence would have become if someone had given it 20 years and unlimited resources. He sat across from her, not beside her. Across, with the table between them, which she understood was a decision. "Fashion Week," he said. "You're here for work." "I'm here for the Colucci presentation. I'm doing their campaign packaging." She paused. "You know Colucci?" Something crossed his face. "Lorenzo Colucci is my mother's godson." She stared at him. "Of course he is. How long has it been since you ate?" "I don't remember." "That is not a good answer." "I know." He looked at her for a moment that stretched in ways she could not fully account for. Then he said with the flat precision of someone making a logistical decision and not an emotional one, "You will eat something real. Then I will take you to a doctor to confirm you are not seriously unwell. Then if you want, you can go back to your hotel. And if I don't want?" He was quiet. Then, "We can talk." The doctor confirmed dehydration, exhaustion, low iron, and a stress response that the physician described with clinical gentleness as the body's way of invoking an emergency stop. Amara listened to this and thought, with a clarity that felt almost funny, that her body had chosen an extremely public and inconvenient time to make its point. She was given fluids, supplements, and a list of instructions she tucked into her bag, with the resigned awareness that she would probably follow 2 of them. Then Marco drove her himself, a grey car, quiet engine, the city moving past the windows in blurs of light and marble, to a small restaurant near the Navigli canals, where the owner greeted him by name and gave them a table at the back, near a window that looked out at dark water. They ate. For a long time they didn't talk about anything difficult. He asked about her agency. She asked about the Ferretti Group. She had known, at some point in her late 20s, that he had taken over the business after his father's illness. The architectural firm had expanded under him into design, branding, structural consultation for luxury developers across Europe. She had known this the way you know things about people you've never stopped paying attention to, even when you've stopped admitting it. He asked her where she lived now. Peckham, she told him. He said he had been in London in March for a project. She did not ask why he hadn't reached out. He did not offer an explanation. The things left unsaid between them were beginning to accumulate with a quiet weight, and they both felt it, and neither of them knew yet how to put it down. It was when the plates were cleared and the restaurant had quieted around them that she said it. Not because she had planned to, because the silence had grown so specific and so shaped that speaking into it felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. "I'm sorry for the way I left." He looked at the table. His hands were flat on the surface. She watched him and thought about how little she knew about what these 12 years had cost him, and how much she had assumed his recovery had been faster and cleaner than hers. "You left a note," he said finally. 11 words. He looked up. "You counted." Afterward, for years, something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. There was no outburst, no flood of long-suppressed anger. What there was instead was something rarer and more honest. The look of a man who has been careful with a wound for a long time, deciding, in this specific moment, that careful is no longer the right approach. "I looked for you," he said. "For about 3 weeks, I kept the note. I don't know why. Then I threw it away because keeping it felt like something I couldn't afford. Marco, I'm not saying this to hurt you." His voice was steady, not cold, steady in the way of someone who has done significant internal work and is reporting the findings rather than reopening the damage. "I'm saying it because you said you were sorry. And I want you to know what you're sorry for, not a clean exit, not a necessary ending. You left before you let me try." The canal outside caught a reflection of a street lamp, fragmented it, carried it slowly out of view. "I know," she said. "Why?" She had been waiting for this question for 12 years. She had rehearsed versions of the answer in her head more times than she could count. But sitting here, across from him, with his dark eyes and his steady hands, and the particular vulnerability of a man who had just said something irretrievable, none of the rehearsed versions felt right. What came out was smaller and truer than any of them. "Because I was more afraid of you staying than of you going." He was quiet for a long moment. "Explain that to me." And she did. For the first time in her life, she did. She told him about what it had felt like to love him at 22, not in the romantic, abstract sense, but in the specific and terrifying sense of loving someone whose opinion of her work, whose presence or absence in a room, whose expression when she spoke had begun to matter more than her own. She told him about her mother's hand between her shoulder blades. Stand straight, be seen on your terms. And how she had confused independence with invulnerability. How she had decided, somewhere in that autumn in Florence, that needing him was a structural weakness she couldn't afford to build into her life. She told him about the morning she packed, how methodical it had been, how she had not cried once, and how she had understood later that the absence of tears was not composure, but dissociation, the mind protecting itself from something it couldn't otherwise survive. She told him that she had not let anyone in the same way since, not entirely, not with that specific helplessness, that specific trust. She had been excellent, she had built something real, but some rooms in her had been very carefully kept closed. He listened to all of it without interrupting once. When she finished, he looked out the window for a while. Then he said, "I built the wrong building." She frowned. "What?" "After you left, I had a project, a residential complex in Turin, big commission, important for the firm. I spent 6 months on it, and the whole time I kept designing something that didn't match the brief. Too many open spaces, too much light, too much room for what wasn't there." He paused. "My father asked me what I was building. I told him I didn't know. He said, 'You're building for someone who left.' I fired the design and started over." She sat with that for a moment. "Did it get better?" she asked. "The building or the rest of it?" "Both." "The building was awarded. The rest of it took longer." He looked at her directly. It never completely stopped. And there it was. The thing she had not dared to believe was still possible. Not a declaration. He was too careful for that, too scarred for that. But a truth, offered across a table in a quiet canal-side restaurant in Milan, with all its weight and all its risk intact. She did not reach for it immediately. That would have been the wrong kind of courage, the impulsive kind that collapses under examination. Instead, she asked the harder question. What did your life look like after? He told her. A long engagement in his late 20s to a woman named Sophia, an architect he had met in Rome, warm and serious, and entirely deserving of more presence than he had been able to give her. The engagement ended without bitterness. They had both understood that the center wouldn't hold, and they had parted with a clarity that he described as the kindest thing they had managed together. After that, years of work, of travel, of expanding the firm in ways that his father had considered audacious and that had largely proven correct. Milan, London, Dubai, Tokyo, buildings going up, his name on them. Pride in that, and also the particular hollowness of achievement that has no one specific to carry it home to. He was not asking for sympathy. He was filling in the space she had left behind with something honest, showing her the shape of what her departure had moved through, not to accuse, but to let her see. She told him about her years, too, the agency, the clients, the late nights that she had told herself she preferred. 2 relationships, both real, both careful, both ending in the same way, with good men who eventually said some version of the same thing, that they felt her always holding something back, that they couldn't reach the part of her that mattered most. She had heard that sentence twice and had let it land, and had then gotten very busy with other things. By the time they left the restaurant, it was past midnight. The canals were still and dark, and the city had taken on the particular quiet of a place resting between performances. He walked her to her hotel, not far, 20 minutes along the water, and they walked slowly, the way people walk when they're aware the walk is ending. At the entrance of the hotel, she turned to face him. "I'm here until Saturday," she said. "I know." He paused. "I want to see you tomorrow, not for any other reason than I want to see you." "That's a good reason." "I thought so." She smiled. He saw it, really saw it, the way he used to in Florence, and something in his face released just slightly, like a tension that had been held for longer than was reasonable. "Good night, Amara." "Good night, Marco." She went inside. She did not look back, not because she didn't want to, but because she had learned finally to trust that some things could wait until morning. The next 3 days were not a fairy tale. That matters, and it needs to be said clearly, because the temptation when 2 people rediscover each other after years of absence is to romanticize the reunion into something frictionless, to let the relief of proximity stand in for the harder work of actually knowing each other again. Amara and Marco did not do that, or rather, they tried not to. She had her work. The Colucci presentation was in 2 days, and it was large and complex, and she had 3 junior creatives flying in from London who needed direction. Marco had his own schedule, meetings, site reviews, a structural consultation for a new development near Porta Nuova that had run into complications. They were both people with real lives that did not pause for emotional archaeology. That was important. That was actually what made the time between those things meaningful. They met for lunch the first day, at a cafe near the Duomo that he chose for its particular light at noon, the way it came through the side windows at an angle that turned everything gold. He showed her his current project sketchbooks, not the polished presentations, not the client-ready materials and the actual working notebooks, with the rough ideas and the crossed-out thoughts and the small drawings in the margins that reminded her of the notebooks he had kept in Florence. She paged through them with the careful attention of someone who understood what she was being shown. Not just drawings, the inside of his mind. She reciprocated the next evening by taking him to the Colucci presentation setup, arriving 2 hours before her team so he could see it in its raw, unfinished state, the board still being positioned, the color palette still being refined, the campaign still becoming what it was going to be. He walked the space with the eyes of an architect assessing a structure, and asked questions that were so precisely the right questions that her senior designer paused his work and stared. "He's good," her designer said afterward quietly. I know, she said. What they were doing, she understood, was not courting. They were already past the point where courting would mean anything. What they were doing was verification, showing each other not who they had been at 22, not who they had idealized in absence, but who they actually were now at 34, with all the years and choices and scars in plain view. They were asking each other, can you see this version? The version with the weight of time on it, with the old wounds and the new competence and the hard-won quiet. Can you see this and not flinch? On her last night in Milan, Thursday, with the Curvy presentation delivered and received, with the particular relief of a project that exceeded expectations, they walked for 2 hours without destination. Through the Brera district, past galleries closed for the night with art glowing behind darkened glass. Through a neighborhood she didn't know the name of, where someone was playing piano badly in an apartment above a pharmacy, and the sound fell out into the street without embarrassment. Through a small piazza, where an old man sat alone on a bench with a newspaper reading by the light of a lamppost, in no apparent hurry to be anywhere. She stopped at the edge of the piazza and watched him for a moment. What are you thinking? Marco asked. That I spent a long time believing that needing someone was the same as losing yourself. She looked at the old man, then at Marco. I think I confused the two on purpose, because it was easier to be alone and call it strength than to be with someone and risk the other thing. What other thing? Being seen, really seen, and then left anyway. She paused. I was so afraid you'd eventually look at me the same way everyone does, as something impressive, something useful, and not see what was underneath that. So I left first, before you could. He was quiet for a moment. A car passed somewhere behind them, its headlights sweeping across the piazza and disappearing. What is underneath that? He asked. Not rhetorically. He wanted an actual answer. She thought about her mother's hand between her shoulder blades, about standing straight, about being seen on her own terms, about the difference between being seen on your terms and being truly known, which requires terms you can't fully control. Someone who gets tired, she said. Someone who doesn't always know what she's doing. Someone who cried in a bathroom in Paris for an hour because a client dismissed her work and then walked back out and finished the presentation anyway, and never told anyone about the bathroom part. She looked at him. That part, that's what was underneath. He looked at her for a long time, and then he did the simplest thing. He reached out and pressed his hand flat against her upper back. Not a hold, not a pull, just a steady, solid presence, exactly where her mother used to press, and kept it there. She didn't move. She let herself be steadied. They stood like that in the small piazza, while the old man turned a page of his newspaper, and the badly played piano somewhere above continued its imperfect song. And somewhere in that ordinary, unhurried moment, something that had been out of alignment for 12 years quietly settled back into place. He asked if she would come back to Milan, not as a condition, not as a negotiation, as a real question from a real person who had just been honest about what he wanted. She said yes. Then she asked something she had never asked anyone in quite that way before, whether he would come to London first before she came back. Not because she needed that order, but because she wanted to see him in her world, in Peckham, in her agency, in the particular light of the city that had made her, before anything else was decided. She wanted him to know that version of her, too. She wasn't offering the edited version this time. He said yes without hesitation. On Friday morning, she went to the airport with her portfolio and her luggage and her senior designer, who spent most of the taxi ride talking about the Curvy response and whether they should pursue more Italian clients. She answered him with the clear, competent part of her brain, while the rest of her was quietly holding the weight of the last 4 days. Not feverishly, not with the anxious grip of someone afraid of losing something, but with the steadiness of someone carrying something real. Her phone buzzed near the gate. A message from Marco. 3 lines. The building I told you about. The one in Turin. The one my father said I was building for someone who left. I went back and looked at the original design this morning. I understand now what I was trying to make. I think I was trying to make you room. She read it twice. She sat down in the gate seat and looked out at the grey tarmac and the waiting planes and thought about rooms, about the ones she had designed for other people's lives, and the ones she had kept locked inside her own, and what it meant to finally hand someone the key, not because you had to, but because you had decided with full knowledge of the risk that this was what trust actually looked like. Not certainty, not safety. Just the deliberate choice to let someone in all the way in, into the unedited rooms. She typed back, "I'll see you in 3 weeks. I'll leave the lights on." She put her phone away. The gate agent called her Rao. She stood, pulled her bag onto her shoulder, and walked toward the plane with her shoulders straight, not performing composure, not performing strength, not making herself smaller or more contained. Just walking the way her mother had always wanted her to walk, as someone who had decided finally to take up the space she was offered. Not because she had found someone to make her whole. She had never been broken, but because wholeness, she had finally understood, was not the same as solitude. You could be complete and still choose to let someone stand beside you. You could be strong and still let a hand press steady against your back. You could be yourself, fully without apology, and still belong to someone, not instead of yourself, alongside. She had left Milan 12 years ago in the middle of a night, packed in an afternoon, with 11 words on a piece of paper and a kind of grief she hadn't known how to name. She left it now in full daylight, with her name on a campaign that would run in 6 European cities, with a text message still warm on her phone, with the memory of a man's hand steady between her shoulder blades in a small piazza where a piano played badly and beautifully and without apology in the dark. Some things, when they are real enough, survive the distance we put between ourselves and them, not unchanged, not the same, but alive, carrying in their altered shape the exact evidence of everything they endured to still be standing, like buildings that have been revised and re-revised until they finally, after years of wrong attempts and honest failures, begin to look like what they always were meant to be. Like two people who had spent 12 years becoming who they needed to be in order to finally properly find each other. Like a story that began on cold marble in Milan and ended, for now, with a gate agent calling a name and a woman standing up and walking, unhurried and unashamed, into whatever came next. If this story reached something in you, if you've ever left something before you let it try, if you've ever chosen distance over the risk of being truly known, leave a comment below. Tell us what you would have done differently. And if you're not subscribed yet, the button is right there. Every story we tell is made for exactly the moment you needed it.